Good morning, everyone. This is Denis Daly with another recording for Voices of Calm. This morning I'm joined by two colleagues from the other side of the country, Elizabeth Chambers and David Crickett, both actors working in Sydney. And this morning we'll be presenting a story by Edward Dyson called His Bad Luck, which is a story of love, true or not, which hasn't quite run smooth. So I'll be playing the part of the narrator and Mr. Gray. Elizabeth will be playing the part of Victoria Macdougal, and David will be playing the part of Harry Gray. So, His Bad Luck by Edward Dyson. The lovers were not animated by any romantic appreciation of the picturesque in selecting the western slope of Magpie Hill for their meeting place. The trysting spot possessed one advantage. It was secluded. Since the Macdougals had given up their search for the reef, believed to exist in the locality, as a bad job, they were never led in that direction by inclination, and rarely by duty. The coarse grass, growing sparingly in the hard, hungry soil, seldom enticed the cattle from the flats near the river. On the hillside, the gums grew straggling and strangely contorted, and only a few clumps of drooping, stunted saplings relieved the dull brown expanse of surface with a touch of bright green, and offered anything like shelter from the penetrating rays of the fierce summer sun, now glinting upon the motionless leaves and weaving an ebullient mirage down in the dry bed of Spooner's Creek. Harry Gray waited at the foot of the hill, evidently in no very gracious humour. With his hands thrust deeply into his pockets, and his back set against a tree, he gazed gloomily at his feet, propped out before him, seeking a satisfactory solution of the difficulty he had in hand, and which, for the past 19 hours, sleeping and waking, had defied his not particularly ingenious mind. His boots suggested nothing, and time was pressing. The girl might come at any moment, and his diplomacy was equal to no better line of action than the bald and bitter truth. Any fool can tell the simple truth. What the young man wanted was a lie that would fit the bill, and at the same time save him the indignity of a confession of his own weakness. Open confession is good for the soul, but when one's confessor is a pretty young woman, with reserve of native dignity, to whom a fellow has sworn eternal constancy 1,000 times, and undying devotion as often again, and the confession is a cruel renunciation of her affection and her fealty, one is so far lost to the teachings of his youth as to be willing to give all his moral copybook maxims for a really serviceable deceit. Harry groaned dismally and vented his feelings on his horse, but Eaglehawk, accustomed to these impassioned addresses, and stung out of all patience by the voracious flies, continued to paw up the dirt and lash out viciously with his heels, regardless of his owner's ill humour and his objurgations. When the young man heard the rattle of a horse's hoofs above on the ridge, he abandoned all thoughts of subterfuge and resolved to make a virtue of necessity. He would be candid. He would give a plain statement of the case. They must separate and endeavour to forget each other. Family reasons, and so on, rendered it imperative. An air of melancholy, tempered with firmness, was necessary to the explanation. Harry assumed such an air and awaited the ordeal. But as the sound of hoof-beats grew nearer, his firmness melted into trepidation, and his melancholy dwindled into a pitiful shamefacedness, for beneath the veneer of sophistry with which he had tried to delude his better self, there was a consciousness of the paltry nature of the part he was playing, and a still, small voice told him that selfishness and not filial affection prompted his action. Comet came over the hill at a rattling gallop, clearing the logs and stumps and clumps of scrub in his long swinging stride, and his mistress sat him with the ease of a bush-bred girl, to whom a good horse is one of the necessities of life, and with a grace rarely seen in bush or town.
Whoa, boy!
Vic brought the nag up, standing within a few feet of her lover, and dropped lightly to the ground before he could offer assistance. No doubt the young man shrank from the idea of offending Victoria Macdougal. The distressing nature of his task came home to him with an increase of bitterness as she stood there, smiling coyly and curtsying with mock dignity. She looked prettier than ever today. Her cheeks glowed like newly blown briar roses after rain, and her beautiful hair clung in exquisite little curls about her white brow and her dainty pink ears. He noted, with a great regret at his heart, the elegance of her slim figure in the light, well-fitting habit she wore. Her lips were even more tempting than usual, too, and he thought, sighing, that her fine eves had assumed that her fine eyes had assumed a brighter blue, but were gentler withal. She was sweet and inviting, but he did not kiss her. He leaned against the tree more determinedly, and ruefully congratulated himself upon his strength of mind. Victoria missed the customary salutation, and noted Harry's reticence, and her manner changed at once. She also could be cold and careless.
Good afternoon, Mr. Grey.
They might have met for the first time at the show ball last week.
Good afternoon, Vic.
Harry felt supremely uncomfortable and tugged at Eaglehawk's rein and bullied the horse in a poor endeavour to hide his discomposure and to avoid looking into her beautiful, inquisitive eyes. Harry is a tall, strong fellow, spoken of, by most of his male friends, as a good fellow, usually with a superfluous adjective, be it regretfully recorded, with an ordinarily well-developed sense of humour, but lacking the moral stamina to act up to it in all cases. He is the first son of old Jock Grey of Wombat. Grey of Wombat is a successful farmer and breeder in so large a way as almost to merit the dignity of being included among Victoria's squattocracy. Vic is the daughter of George Macdougal, a farmer in a smaller way, and not a good farmer at that. He and his big athletic sons are imbued with the digger's passion and devote more time to prospecting up and down the creek and trenching for the reef than to the prosaic work of cutting scrub, ring barking, fencing, and putting down crops. A Jew from the city has been seen wandering over their land, and there is much talk amongst the widely scattered neighbours of mortgages and liens on stock. After kicking at a tuft of grass with a brave show of unconcern for a few awkward moments, and trying hard to control his nerves and his ideas, Harry became desperate.
Vic, I'm going to make you hate me.
A shade of deep concern came over her face.
Hate you, Harry. You frighten me. You look serious enough to have had all the mounted police in the colony on your track. Have you been bank breaking or cattle stealing? Well, sir, don't you see how impatient I am?
He hung Eaglehawk up to the tree and pointed to a log by a clump of saplings.
Hadn't you better sit in the shade?
He made this arrangement cunningly, that he might stand behind her whilst telling his story. He was afraid of the sudden unveiling of that deeper light in her eyes, which had flashed forth, at times, to his great discomfort. Vic turned to obey him, and, sitting upon the log, with a stick she had picked from the ground, she played nervously amongst the stony soil at her feet, and Harry Grey stood behind her and faltered through his explanation.
Vic, I have to give you up. We must meet no more, but just forget all this foolishness that has been between us. You know that our father are bad friends. Dad expects me to marry Mary Layla up at Gumleaf, and he has heard of my meetings with you. Sandy Martin dropped to it and reported it to the boss, who tackled me about it yesterday, and I up and told him we were sweethearts and that I had asked you to marry me. And Dad tore round and went on like a dingo in a snap trap. Said I must drop fooling or go and punch cattle for my tucker for the rest of my days. He swore that if I did not cut this, I could give up all thoughts of working in with him or of ever owning a shilling of his or an acre of wombat land. And he means it. I didn't reckon on the old man cutting up Rusty about it, but he is real mad. And as he's got the whip hand of me, I had to cry small and promise him I'd ride across for the last time today and square matters up like. We must part for good and all, Vic.
The young woman's face paled, and her head bent lower, but she did not speak. She still played nervously amongst the dead leaves and stones with her stick, and struggled bravely to stifle the sobs that rose in her throat.
It isn't that Dad has any objection to you, Vic, Miss Macdougal, or doesn't think you good enough for me, or anything like that. But Wombat needs more cash than he can command to work it properly. And your people are too poor, you know.
The girl started as the last words fell from his lips, but gave no answer for a minute or more, drawing the dirt and dead leaves back over the small hole she had made in the ground. She dropped the stick, and then she turned her white face towards him.
Too poor.
Harry flushed a deeper red, and looked fixedly from the eyes that turned upon him, full of bitter reproach.
Yes, too poor. I hope you won't feel cut up and that you'll soon forget.
I may not soon forget, but I shall not feel our parting much. I never knew you till now, Harry.
He was going on to explain or excuse his conduct in a feeble way, but she gave him no attention. Comet, who, throughout the interview, had been fighting the flies at a little distance, came in answer to the call of his mistress, and she sprang lightly to the saddle from the log, disdaining Harry's proffered assistance. He looked on miserably as she gathered up the reins.
Have you nothing to say?
What need I say? Your father has settled the matter.
The young man winced, and he gazed gloomily after her as she put her horse at the brush fence, and rode at a dangerous pace along the foot of the hill, till her figure was lost to his view beyond the bend. Then he mounted Eaglehawk, and that game little animal broke his record for 7 miles in the run to Wombat. Miss Victoria did not ride straight home. She pulled up and dismounted by a patch of young wattles, about 1.5 miles from the trysting place, and in a familiar shaded nook indulged in a long reverie, ending in tears, and then took herself severely to task, and scolded herself into a proper state of dignity and self-respect. 2 days later, the whole of the district was in a fever of excitement over the intelligence that the Macdougals had struck a golden lode at the foot of Magpie Hill, on their sister's selection. The news reached Wombat, and Harry and his father rode across to inspect the find. Intelligence of gold discoveries travels through mysterious agencies, and flies to every point of the compass, as if a staff of aerial Mercuries were always in waiting to carry the electrifying news from ear to ear. When the Greys reached the paddock, there was a great crowd about the cutting in which the Macdougals, father and sons, were at work. Miners and prospectors had gathered from miles around, and scores of envious agriculturists swelled the excited throng. One glance at the cap of the reef convinced all, with the slightest knowledge of mining, that the Macdougals had struck it rich and were in for a big thing. The outcrop showed almost as much gold as stone, and the pure yellow metal shone with dazzling lustre in the bright rays of the midday sun. The men had already laid bare a great quantity of the quartz, showing that the reef widened as she dipped, and to the astonished onlookers it seemed that there must be a fortune now in sight. Harry Grey stood speechless, staring at the reef. He had some little knowledge of quartz mining, and had seen golden stone before, but never anything like this. It was not the gold alone that amazed him. He remembered how, only a few hours before, he had stood upon this very spot, within a foot or two of the great treasure glowing before his eyes, telling Victoria Macdougal that she was too poor ever to be the wife of the son of Grey of Wombat. The young man plucked at his father's sleeve and backed out of the crowd. His, eye, his eyes danced with excitement, and the hand on his father's arm shook like that of an old man. Harry waited until they were out of earshot of the milling crowd before bursting into speech.
Great Scott, Dad, listen. I stood on top of that golden pile when I broke with Vic on Monday. My boots must have touched the gold. She sat upon that log, which they have been forced to roll aside to get at the reef, while I babbled about her poverty like an inspired jackass.
Mr. Grey held his chin and seemed to pull his naturally long visage down to an extraordinary length as he heard this, and the ludicrous expression of intense solicitude grew in his porky face. "Could ye muck it up again, boy?"
Good day, Mr. Grey. How do you do, Master Harry?
It was Vic who had obtruded into their conversation. She looked at Harry with a little smile that made him flush to the eyes. She wore the dove-coloured riding dress he had so often admired, and her abundant bright hair rippled from under her hat. The young man noticed, with selfish satisfaction, that her face was unusually pale, and, despite the faint smile upon her lips, she did not look as happy and radiant as might have been expected of one who had experienced great and sudden good fortune. The young man indicated the cutting with a toss of his hand.
They have struck it at last, Vic.
I have struck it. At about 2 on Monday afternoon, I was sitting on a log over the spot where my brothers were working, playing amongst the dirt with a stick and listening to your story. You'll remember, Harry, when I turned up this golden key to wealth.
She held out for their inspection a fine nugget on which a quaint pattern was wrought in white quartz.
You see, it is almost the shape of a broken anchor.
She turned away, but paused after walking a few yards, and, looking back, said, with an artfully ingenuous air,
By the way, Mr. Grey, have you heard of my brother Dick's engagement to Mary Layla of Gumleaf? They have been in love with each other for some time, it appears, but said nothing about it till yesterday.
When they had gone, father and son stood in thoughtful attitudes for a few moments. When she had gone, father and son stood in thoughtful attitudes for a few moments, and then turned, and each looked into the other's blank face and breathed a great sigh. Harry cut savagely at a dandelion with his riding whip.
Just my infernal bad luck.
The end. We hope you've enjoyed this little vignette. Thanks to my collaborators from Sydney, David and Elizabeth. And stay safe and healthy in this difficult time. And please feel free to visit Voices of Calm for some more entertaining stories. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.